Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting session of hashtag Gather to Grow here with Food from Zanzi on Twitter Spaces. I'm your host, Dawn Numdu, and we do this once a week where we invite experts to cover a topic that's relatable to both new farmers, medium farmers, commercial producers within the agricultural space. And we hope to kind of do a bit of a knowledge sharing, idea sharing, connecting with everyone within the sector. And that is the aim of these sessions that we do. Last week, we started with a very insightful topic and something that I think all farmers should be aware of, and that's, the impact of climate change and how we can adapt to it, to adapt our practices and adopt more smart agricultural farming or practice within our day-to-day operations, thinking more around regenerative agriculture, working with nature instead of against it to better our own farming futures and those that will come as part of the next generation. I'm going to start with a round of introductions of our speakers, and I'd like to thank them very much for making time to talk to me this evening and to talk to all of us and share their knowledge and expertise on this topic. So I'm going to start with Diana. Diana, I've known for a while. She's come a long way with the Food from Zanzi family. She's an MSc plant breeding student at the University of Free State, and it's such a pleasure to have her with me. Diana, maybe just a bit about yourself, how you got into agriculture, and more about the work that you do for the university as a plant breeder. Thank you.
I'm currently doing my second year in plant breeding, as Don have said. I'm looking at FHB, Fusarium head blight in wheat. So this disease is caused by different Fusarium species, and it can influence the yield production and also contaminate the crop. The contamination can result to different types of diseases, such as diarrhea, abortion in animals, and the list goes on. So right now we're looking at if there is a need to breed for DON accumulation in South African cultivars. Even though there isn't type 1 and type 2 resistance, which is resistance to initial infection, which is type 1, then type 2 refers to the disease spread. Currently, there are cultivars that are resistant to initial infection and disease spread, but they're not South African cultivars, which raises issues like will they be adapted to being planted to South Africa. So more research has gone into looking if type 1 and type 2 resistance is useful. So that's why we're looking at type 3 resistance, which is the DON accumulation of the mycotoxins, which contaminate the crop. Currently, I am doing a part-time internship at ARC Small Grain in Glen, where we're working on trying to digitalize soil types in South Africa, where farmers, if you have a specific land and you want to know what type of soil is in your area, you do not have to go there and get soil scientists to do tests. You can just go to the GIS system and get the information from there.
Thank you so much, Diana. What a great introduction. And awesome that you're sharing more about your research and what you guys are doing. And I think you've basically brought it in nicely, introducing my other guest this evening is Dr. Bello. Dr. Bello is also with the Agricultural Research Council's grain crop team. So maybe just an introduction to you, Dr. Bello. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for being here. Maybe just an introduction of who you are, what you do, and more about your research at the ARC. Thank you so much.
My name is Said Bello, and Salam Alaikum, Don. I'm a researcher at the Green Crops in ARC in Touch. I work on different research that has to do with underutilized crops, drought-tolerant crops, anything that has to do with agronomy of crops.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello. It's so great to have you with us and to share your knowledge and expertise. I usually do like to find out how people got into agriculture. So maybe you can just indulge me by talking to that question for a moment.
I really wanted to become a pharmacist or a researcher in agriculture. I think I would say agriculture called me. So I'm really enjoying this. The interest actually starts from the high school where we normally have garden at home at the school. So from there, we started developing different interests, especially in crops. Remember, agriculture has got different specialization, especially the animals and crop. That is what people normally think about. I know agric is much more than that. But my interest lies in the crop. On getting to the opportunity to study for PhD in drought-tolerant crops actually was very exciting, and I'm really enjoying it because this is actually taking me into a new field, exploring new things that even I think we can really see in the impact, most especially in the line of the climate change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and obviously being here and being part of tonight's conversation. I have two more guests that I'd like to introduce. I'm going to start with Tumo. Tumo is also a plant breeding student and also currently busy with an internship, but with the South African Sugarcane Research Institute. So maybe just a bit about you, Tumo, how you got into agriculture, where it all started for you, and also maybe just a little bit more about what you do within the space. Thanks.
My name is Tumo Makgeta, as mentioned. I'm currently doing my MSc study with the South African Sugarcane Research Institute. And I think my journey into agriculture started when I was very young. I used to be one of those kids that loved playing with mud, insects, always had green fingers. But it kind of grew further as I went into high school and learned more about, DNA, plants, all these things. That's when I realized that, I wanted to pursue science, but within the field of agriculture. And that's when I found molecular plant breeding. And it's been an amazing love story with the two. So yeah, my research currently is looking at developing genetically modified sugarcane. We're doing this specifically for the small-scale farmers. As you know, the KZN is struggling a bit with Aldana, which is a sugarcane borer. We're also looking at inserting genes that also provide herbicide resistance. This is basically to allow small-scale farmers to basically cut the input costs that are related with controlling these pests and diseases within the field. So we're doing something cool. We're looking at, the number of copies that is present, and how stable are these to ensure that, future plant breeders can basically integrate these and develop new resistant crop varieties. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. And I love the part about having green fingers and always playing in the mud. And that's kind of when your passion started for it. I always love hearing, the beginning stories of where it all started when you realize that this is definitely where you want to be. So thank you so much for that. My last and final guest that I'd love to introduce to you is Ridu Kunda, also a PhD plant breeding student, and she's at the University of the Free State. Thank you so much. Maybe a bit about you, where it all started, and what you enjoy most about what you do.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Ridu Kunda Sibada, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Free State. And my research is mainly focused on improving the nutritional quality of wheat. How it started is that I have a father who has quite a green thumb. So he grew all sorts of crops and it always fascinated me. So I really grew the love for agriculture, and I also took agricultural sciences in high school. So I really fell in love with agriculture. And then when I came to varsity, I just fell into the agricultural faculty. And what I'll say I love the most about agriculture is just having to just deal with the plants. And I really enjoy working with the plants. But also the part that I love the most is that we're just bringing in solutions for the world crisis, the crisis that we have in the world now, addressing food insecurity and all.
Thank you so much. And I think that beautifully brings us into an introduction to our discussion tonight. Now, in our last session, we highlighted, what climate adaptability is. We shared an explanation on what we mean when we refer to climate adaptable crops and the benefits of adopting these climate smart agricultural practices. I'd like to maybe start, just with a quick recap as an introduction to those who may have missed the last session, and also just to all of the speakers who can either agree or disagree with our speaker from part one of this discussion. Sikolise Mlinga mentioned, and she's a soil scientist and senior analyst in sustainable agriculture for Green Cape. She said that climate adaptable crops, or when we think about climate smart agricultural practices, it means that there's a strong focus, on climate smart agriculture looking at an integrated approach to better manage or improve productivity of crops, land, livestock, forest, and at times also fisheries. Now, is there any part of the statement that you guys disagree with, or that you'd maybe like to add on as a start of part 2 of this conversation? Dr. Bello, I'm going to ask you to maybe just start us off, and then we'll get contributions or inputs from our other speakers as well. Thank you so much.
We're trying to find solutions to climate change impact and effect. So in terms of the adaptation, now there are a lot of crops that we there are a lot of research going on that has to do with the usage of crops that are adaptable in terms of the change when it comes to the drought, because climate change is going to bring a lot of impact that is going to be detrimental to our production. For example, the drought, the heat. So we need lots of different crops that's going to be adaptable to all this effect. There is this particular aspect of crops that we've not been able to really explore most are actually much more beneficial. These are terms the underutilized crops. Underutilized crops are actually much more drought tolerant. Not only that, while we're actually enjoying the adaptation impact or effect of the crop, we can also still look at the quality of our food that's being produced from the underutilized crops. I've worked on some underutilized crops that are very, very good in terms of the drought tolerancy, but not only that, they also helps in terms of our food quality. For example, we work on the pear millet. Pear millet is gluten-free, and it's kind of requires less input compared to our exotic staple crops. So if you keep on looking at different types of underutilized crops, we're going to actually get some help. Not only that, there are still a lot of underutilized crops that are drought tolerant. They are also possess lots of medicinal values. Even our vegetables. I work on amaranthus. It's kind of drought tolerant, but it's also have medicinal values too. If you look at closely, there are still more benefits in terms of underutilized crops.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello. Either of our other speakers want to maybe contribute to what Dr. Bello was saying, and maybe adding to the first statement around what climate adaptable crops are, and more around the thinking of, climate smart agriculture and the benefits thereof for not only food production, but also long term for food security globally. Any takers? Diana, Tumo?
I wouldn't say I disagree or agree on the statement, but I think what I'm struggling with is the term adaptability. As a plant breeder or as a plant geneticist, my concern would be crops that are more stable. We want to get the same genotype or basically the product that we want. We want good yield. We want to have that to be stable across years, whether or not the climate is bad or good. So I think going forward as, farmers and agriculturalists, we need to look at developing and using crops that we know that have a stable genotype so that it's not as affected by the environment. And, as we know, crops are usually affected by what we call the G by E interaction, whereby a crop is grown in a certain environment, under certain conditions, it will produce a certain genotype. As with adaptability, it's more of the plant getting used to the environment, but with stability, you're more looking at receiving, the same amount of yield, the same amount of product over the number of years, over a long period, and over these varying climates, which in the coming years will be unpredictable. So we want to have a genotype that we know we can rely on in terms of producing food in different locations under different environments. Yes, I think that's what I kind of thought of when I heard that statement.
Thanks, Tumo. And maybe my next question, and maybe either Diana could respond to this one. Do you think that, enough farmers are thinking about this or using these methods or practices as a start going into the sector? Or is it something that mostly and maybe commercial producers focus on? What does a small scale farmer look at going into the sector, just starting out, if it's like from backyard upwards? Should this be a practice across board? How can we measure it? Where do farmers access the information that Tumo spoke about? Just as a start. Remember, we have people with different backgrounds in the space, and so I'm kind of just trying to get it so that everyone can understand it and incorporate it into their daily lives and their practice on farm level? Thanks.
So based on what crops a farmer can use as a startup, usually the corporates have information. They will stock up on crops that are more suitable for that specific region. Back home in Pongola, I would assume that the corporates in Pongola would sell stuff that are suitable for that environment. And if not, seeds usually come with seed information, and farmers can get some information based on the seed information provided on whether it's suitable for their type of land or not. So there is ways to get information, and they can also participate in workshops provided by the government or the seed companies. They have access to extension officers in their area. If they don't know of any, they can go to the agricultural department of each place to get information there. Because I know the Department of Agriculture is really trying to help farmers, even if it's just startup farmers. Because back in my hometown, some people from rural areas, they don't even need to buy seeds. The government provides. You just need to know when seeds are available, when is the Department of Agriculture giving out seeds. Sometimes they even give out equipment as startups to help you and also see you through the process as you try to familiarize yourself with agriculture and growing your own crops.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I'd maybe like to move the conversation to another aspect of what we spoke about in part one. And that was specifically, we touched on policies that support climate smart agricultural practices in South Africa. And I was wondering if we could maybe just do a breakdown of possibly outlining these policies for our listeners. We won't be able to cover all of them in depth, but maybe just to highlight some of it and maybe talk about what the benefits are and what government is doing to aid farmers, and also keep in mind that we need to start thinking around smart agricultural practices to sustain food production in our country and on the continent. Dr. Bello, would you like to take this one?
So what I was saying at the beginning has to do with the responsibility of the government. You remember the responsibility has to do with the food security for the populace. So in terms of the food security, we have to increase the production. And this production has to do with the farmers. So there are lots of policy that's actually going on in terms of educating the small-scale farmers by the government through the extension officers. So it is not only educating them, we have to really see how much are they producing? Are they really contributing to the food security in the country? Not only that, what is their practices? What do they engage? Do they even know about climate change? Do they know about the climate change effect on their production? So all these things has to do with lots of policy from the Department of Agriculture. They are really sponsoring research in terms of this, trying to develop small-scale farmers. Not only that, I think for commercial farmers too, there are a lot of stakeholders that's also assisting the farmers in terms of not only the education, but it has to do with the financial support too, in terms of the loans, the advisory services. So government is really trying to help through their policy implementation, through the researchers, just like ARC, they sponsor some of the work done by the institutes, and also even at the university levels, because look at WRC, Water Research Commission of South Africa, they are actually working under the umbrella of trying to ensure to manage the water scarcity in terms of the food production through the agricultural produce. So government is really trying. There are lots of policy going on there, and I believe there are still more work to be done. There are still more niche to actually be filled in terms of this research, considering the policy that is going on now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello. And we actually have a comment here from one of our listeners. And I think this is specifically when Diana was referring to the type of support that government gives farmers to adopt these smart agricultural practices. And the question is asking, I actually don't know how to even talk to government about getting access to climate adaptable seeds. Who do I call? What do I ask? Is there any specific information that I need to have? So that's a question from one of our listeners. I'm not sure if either Diana or Tumo or Dr. Bella would like to take this one in response. And I think it's a very important basic question to ask or answer. If it is that I go to the ARC, where do I go? Where do I even start? Do I just email the information line, info line? Do I call them directly? Is there a specific department? Diana, Tumo, would either one of you like to take this one?
To give you a kind of a small background, there is a particular work going on with developing particular maize variety called WEMA. It is water efficient maize for Africa. So with this maize, it's actually directed towards adaptation or climate change adaptation techniques. So they actually use much more water efficient than the other varieties. So they're trying to use the drought tolerance mechanism to make use of the water more efficiently. So varieties are out there, and I believe it can easily be accessible through the maize producers. But if you can email ARC, I think you can get directed towards the right place to actually get it. I know we were involved in some kind of a training with small-scale farmer and extension officers in the Limpopo. Lots of small-scale farmers are actually, they gave us a good feedback that they were able to get this seed from the government, from the Department of Agri. I think they were the one that provided this seed for them. I think it's one of the programs trying to support small-scale farmers in Limpopo. So, and we got a good feedback from them in terms of this variety. So it's either you can contact the Department of Agri, the crop section, or you can email us ARC, especially grain crops in Potchefstroom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello. We have another question here from one of our other listeners, and I'm so happy to see the questions coming through. Sobe is asking, how does one use GIS for soil analysis? Which website and or software to use? I hope I'm reading that properly and that you guys obviously understand what I'm asking, and whoever would like to contribute or respond to that question, thank you so much.
So based on the GIS system, the soil types is still a project that's undergoing. It's not available yet. It's still being processed. It might take years for it to be able to be out for people to access. Because right now we're using old maps which have soil information, which we digitalizing, but new maps need to also be made so more accurate data can also be incorporated into the system. So it might take years before it's available, but it's good that there is progress on it.
I'm a total newbie, guys. So what is the GIS system for soil analysis? Just to be clear and understand it better for those who might not be aware.
So to just simplify it, just as when you are looking for a location you do not know, you'd use GPS to pinpoint where exactly it is. So with this GIS system, you'll then use the coordinates given. So let's say Bloemfontein at a certain point, let's say Get 5 UFS has this type of soil. Then you'll go into the GIS system, it will give you the coordinates and lead you to that exact spot using GPS.
Thank you so much for the question. Tumo, I see you unmuting your mic. Would you like to respond to the question?
No, I just wanted to add further on what Diana's saying. So basically, GIS is very important for farmers. It's basically developed in order to assist farmers. So it's not a tool that is used to benefit the researchers, but it's for the benefit of the farmers. So basically, it forms the basis for tools. We call them, dashboards or web apps that farmers can access to find out more information about what is going on around the environment that they are producing at. So, for example, at Sashi, we have a lot of applications. Some of them are MyChasm Lite. It's web-based. It's also a phone application. So farmers can access that to kind of find out what's going on in terms of cane yields around the environment, soil analysis, as mentioned. And it can also be used, to forecast yields within that area. So it can be used for it can be used to provide the farmer with a lot of information about what is going on around the environment, forecasting any incoming diseases so that farmers can respond quickly by, applying pesticides or basically protecting their crops against anything that may disturb the production of their crops. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add on top of what Diana has said.
Thanks, Tumo. Again, to everyone listening, Many farmers have obviously already incorporated these renewable energy practices. They're using, renewable energy technologies in general in aid of their farming practice, to better their farming operations, from solar powered irrigation systems to some farmers even farming off the grid. Apps are being used. What other support is out there, either through research or initiatives that drive the research to encourage climate smart agricultural practices that farmers can tap into? If it's more technology available, if it's more research that's available, ongoing research that you guys are all involved in, information that is released to the public, to farmers that they should be on the lookout for, how do they stay abreast of what's happening? Dr. Bello, would you like to start?
I want to start from the app. The app actually can actually be applicable to irrespective of the type of the farmer that you are. Because for commercial farmers, they can actually go into precision farming. Even we can go back to the GIS that you talked about now. You remember, we can do the soil analysis, but you can still incorporate it into your program and become a kind of a precision farming so that you can really identify. You don't have to waste money on the fertilizer. You just have to apply the fertilizer to the particular section of your field that really need it. So the precision farming in terms of the water application in terms of your irrigation can also help. So the GIS can help you in terms of this. Not only that, you remember there is drones now. People use drones for different application in the field. Remember, we said that climate smart has to do with adaptation. It is not only adaptation, it still has to do with the mitigation also. We have to try to prevent what is really contributing to the climate change. So if you can minimize your chemical application, the usage of the energy, I think you also helping in terms of mitigating against the climate change. So now going back to the app now, there are different types of app. There are some apps that can actually be used to advise the farmers, the small scale farmers, in terms of their management practices. And also some commercial farmers also use the apps to also monitor their precision farming or in terms of their management practices too. So all these particular technologies can help in terms of the climate as a kind of a climate smart technique. Not only that, I think our program also, in terms of the what are we producing, the way we're producing it. For example, now we're talking about conservation agriculture. We're talking about the types of the crop. That is where I actually mentioned underutilized crop. Are you also practicing crop rotation, or is it intercropping? Because all this can also of making your field, your soil, be sustainable for a very long time. And it's also going to help you to reduce in terms of your inputs. For example, trying to rotate your cereal with the legumes can improve your soil fertility for the next season.
Okay, I think he was mentioning that he is struggling with his network due to load shedding. So I think he really has so much to contribute, and I hope that he's able to connect with us again soon before we wrap up the conversation. I have a few more talking points listed, but I think just to touch on some of the areas that he spoke about towards the end, rotational cropping. On this platform, we've spoken a lot around cover crops, intercropping as well as a topic as part of Gather to Grow. And I think maybe we can recap those. And I'll also share some of our previous session connected to this topic as well, which I think is great. It's amazing to see how we can call on previous discussions and points that we made before. Dr. Bello, is your network more stable? Do you want to just finish the point that you made and then I'll move on to my next question? I really want to give him a chance to finish his point. Just the last parts where you spoke about intercropping as a method as well.
Actually, I was just like trying to emphasize the importance of this particular technology that you can reduce your inputs. It could be a kind of a way of mitigating against the climate change in terms of reducing your inorganic fertilizer applications. So all these things actually are part of the mitigation against the climate change.
Thank you, Dr. Bello. And I think that you have so much to share. So I will try and invite you back to the session one of these sessions in the future for you to be able to share more of the work that you're doing and more of the research you're doing specifically on grain crops, on Gather to Grow as well. Now, another key focus, part of our last discussion, was obviously the impact of on-farm practice on trade and exports when it comes to, keeping in mind how you practice and how you farm and the way you farm. Do you think that this is a factor that farmers should always keep in mind or consider when they think about how they produce their food? And then I'm going to ask my second question as well, just in the interest of time, and then you guys can either answer the one or the other. How do we continue to stay abreast of the foods that we grow now and how it will change in the future? We see an increase of people growing or more indigenous crops. 2 weeks ago, we spoke about mopane worms, for example, on a Twitter space. How do we see, trends of people, producing more edible insects and how that is growing and trending? So maybe we can just touch on those two topics in terms of food production and how we will produce food in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Two more, Diana. I want to hear from Ritukunda because we haven't really heard much from her.
I would just like to speak on the second one, that how do we stay abreast of the foods that we grow and how we see this changing. I think one of the most problematic thing that we see now is over-relying on one crop. And I think that in the near future, we could look at maybe evolving our diets as people so that we just don't rely on, let's say, maybe wheat. And maybe we can look at introducing new crops into our diets. And I think that can actually help.
Yeah, no, definitely. Not just new crops, insects and other things into our food and what we eat. It's natural for some people in other parts of the world and even here in Africa. So I think we'll definitely be eating more insects into the future. Let's try our chef skills and improve what we take in day to day. Diana, I see you unmuted your microphone.
Yes, growing more indigenous crops keeps food on the table, and it's also promoting alternative food sources, which are less damaging to the ecosystem and climate. South African mopane worms are also an example, and grasshoppers. Endemic species feed from such vegetation, the indigenous vegetation. So therefore, if we eliminate alien species that require a lot of water and nutrients to grow compared to the indigenous crops and plants that do not require such nutrients and resources, which will therefore increase the biodiversity of just South African biodiversity, therefore increasing our food sources. Even though most fruit trees, pine trees that we rely on for paper, apples, citrus, and all those alien invasive species, we can maybe make a situation where we can compromise for those, but others we do not have to compromise for because they cause things like floods, soil erosion, landslides. By saying floods, it's because water table is so degraded to a point where it doesn't function as it used to.
Thank you so much, Diana. Yeah, that definitely brings me to my next question because in part one, there were specific crops that we spoke about that maybe are more adaptable. And I'm very cautious of using that word, especially with a bunch of scientists in the space. And especially after Dr. Bello's remarks as an introduction to the session. But maybe crops that are less stressed or when it comes to these varied climatic conditions or when placed under these stressful climatic conditions. That's a better way to phrase it. I think last time we spoke about soya beans and two of those specific crops. I was wondering if there would be a possibility to list a few more based on the work that you guys are doing and maybe more on these specifically genetically modified seeds and plants that we can take into account to create a more resilient system for farmers to produce the food that we need to eat. Tumi, I'm going to go with you, Dr. Bello, if you don't mind. I'm going to go with Tumo first. Thanks.
I think a lot of foods that are being eaten in other African countries, we should also start introducing them more, especially the ones that are grown in sub-Saharan Africa, where the climate is almost similar to ours. I know Ridokunda's lab is doing a lot of work on cassava plant, which is eaten in West Africa, Central Africa. So I think that's one of the most interesting crops that we could adopt as South Africans. Cassava is a really good plant, and a lot of research is being done in terms of making it more suitable for growth in South Africa. Also, Dr. Bello mentioned, pearl millet, which is one of the crops that I'm actually interested in, and I would love to, do a lot of genetic work around that. It would be a nice crop for us to introduce, especially when it comes to baby foods. It's already been used to make porridge in Indian and African countries, in Indian, Asian and African countries such as India. So I think that's a nice crop that we could adapt as South Africa, because it's almost similar to our, sorghum and maize. So it could also introduce more crop diversity for farmers to kind of play around with. The nice thing about introducing a new crop is that, it also brings in the hype around the crop. So we can also, bring in more profits for the farmer as there's a hype around that plant. So it's benefiting us in terms of, the food is good and healthy for us, but it's also, helping our farmers, get the profit and, reap the rewards for their hard work in the fields. Yeah, so I think Dr. Bello can add more to this.
Thanks, Tomo. I made cassava as part of my list of possible crops to grow, even in my backyard, because my other crops were struggling. Dr. Bello, over to you.
I think let me start from the cassava. Cassava is actually a very good point to start from. There are lots of places that you can find cassava also in South Africa. And the good thing about cassava is it's very, very resilient crop. You don't really need much for the crop to get a good yield in terms of the cassava. But what we also like to emphasize is, can we even look at what are the indigenous crops that people are not even talking about in South Africa that are very, very beneficial? For example, I think amadumbe. Do you also remember amadumbe? There is white melon. There are a lot of good tepe that's actually very, very healthy and beneficial for the drought tolerant. There are a lot of crops in South Africa that we did not actually recognize again. But if we look into them more, you see that we're going to gain more lists. Also, there are a lot of exotic crops also. We working on pigeon pea. Pigeon pea is actually much more from Asia. I think Indians eat it more. I think that's one of their staple crops. And we're working on it, like trying to find where we can, it's much more adaptable in South Africa. And I was surprised that there are a lot of people that are eating it and as a kind of indigenous crop in Malanga and Limpopo. So you can see, if you look like inward in South Africa, we will still find more list, more crop to add to the list that we're talking about now before we go outside the country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello, for that list. And I think a lot of farmers are producing these crops. I know of a few farmers producing amadumbe and cassava. So I definitely look forward to breaking that down in more detail in another session. We're nearing the end of tonight's discussion, and I have just two more questions as we wrap up. I think this past week, I've been listening to the 2023 Regional Climate Smart Agricultural Policy Dialogue that's being hosted by Fanapan, and there's so many important aspects that came out of these discussions, and maybe we could just get one of you guys to respond. If you've been listening to it, what were some of the highlights for you, and also some of these best policies or best practices and the implementation of that when it comes to climate smart agriculture and these frameworks that are set in place and how they should be benefiting farmers in the long run. And then another question would also be around what are those commodities that will be way too expensive to even produce, what some may even refer to foods that climate change will take off the menu. So maybe we can just answer those two questions, and then I'll get you guys to do final comments as we wrap up. We would like to take this question. Rudukunda, I'm going to ask you to at least respond to one of them, even if it's the second question on the foods that you think or suspect that climate change will take off our menus.
I think the crops that are going to be more affected would be the ones that are very sensitive to drought and pests. And we are, as plant breeders, working on resistance and all that. So I'm hoping that they don't really get taken off, but we win the fight against the climate change effects.
Spoken like a true plant breeder. Tumo, so you unmuted first, and then Diana.
I think one food at risk of being taken off, I think it's meat, especially beef. That's one food that is being farmed right now and uses a lot of water. one of our biggest threats to agriculture and farming as a whole, it's water scarcity. So I think it's time that we start looking for, protein alternatives, because it's going to be much more expensive to, farm and produce meat in the coming future. So I think that's one of the food that is going to be removed, as well as rice. We know how it's planted. It's actually planted, inside of water paddies. So as time goes on, it's going to be one of those plants that we're going to have to let go of and look for other alternatives. Looking at the amount of water that's going to be affected in these areas. So I think we should look more into, finding cheaper and more climate adaptable food sources, as we have discussed previously. So I think Dr. Bello can add more for Diana.
Thanks, Timo. Just one question, comment before Diana speaks. We were able to talk on our Farmers Inside Track podcast about lab-grown meats or cultivated meats, and so that's definitely a thing that's happening along the sidelines. So although it's still reliant on animals, it may take off some of the weight or strain from producers that we're going to definitely be eating meat that is grown in a lab. So yeah, that's something to look forward to in the future. Diana, over to you.
Looking at the commodities part of the question, I would say we should maybe adapt to more practical practices like Asia. They only farm what their country can produce, and they eat mostly what their country can produce. So commodities wise, we can maybe get rid of chickpeas, which are native to Peru, which is an arid, snowy region. They don't grow here in South Africa as big as they would in their native land. So we're just trying to incorporate them here, but they're not producing as much as they would were they native. Pineapples, walnuts, we don't need it. We can get the source of nutrients from other crops. Grapes. Food from Zanzi did a documentary on how climate change is influencing the wine production in the Cape. Those are also some of the crops we can maybe live without in South Africa and import, and then just maximize our production on South African adapted crops.
I think people might have a problem with those grapes because some of those grapes get used to produce wine that we're very much known for. Quite valid points made, Diana. So thank you so much. Dr. Bello, your comments on the last two questions?
In terms of the commodity, definitely there is no crop we really want to out because we want to increase our biodiversity too. You remember, we're trying to get more crop into the field. We want to have more choice. So I think we really need to look into the crops that are actually less water efficient, just like maize. And I know there are a lot of work that's been done. Like you said, our plant breeders are there to really help in terms of the adaptation or in terms of the coping mechanism for these new crops. So definitely we still want more crops on the field. We want more on our table. We want different crops on the shelf. For example, I used to say, let's say you go to this camp now, there are lots and lots of different crops ahead. So we want more crops, but the one that's going to be much more expensive to produce are the one that are less water efficient. Before we go, in terms of the concluded climate resilient policy dialogue, I think it's a kind of a eye opener that people are aware, and there are lots of things that actually been going on that governments and the different stakeholders are actually involved in terms of trying to face the challenge, all the challenges that the climate change is actually trying to create for us. There are a lot of work that actually is being done on irrigation. There are a lot of work that also being done in terms of trying to form different farmers community, trying to educate them. So, but what I've seen that for different countries, I think the solutions to their problems are actually tailored towards their own kind of a culture, which I also see that we supposed to also embrace. We really need to understand the farmers, understand their culture. Their culture will be able to help us in trying to prescribe the solutions that's supposed to help them to face the challenges that's been created by climate change. So, though I did not listen to the closing remark today, but I've seen it was kind of a very informative and eye-opener.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello. And yeah, I agree with you. I think there are a number of organizations, private entities, government, the IRC, where you're based, many researchers and scientists working towards coming up with solutions to mitigate the risk of climate change and also ensure that we have a sustainable food production system for many, many years to come. So I hope that this conversation is part and parcel contribution towards that, and that many of you walked away with some insights as to how to better practice smart climate, agricultural practices, keeping in mind what you could possibly diversify your own farming operation with the crops that were suggested by our speakers. And I think there's many conversations we can have around this topic. And so as time goes on, as the rest of this year goes on, I will definitely try to incorporate that into our weekly discussions. I think one more comment here from one of our speakers was saying that he loves his wine too. So there's no way, Diana, that they will give up on the grapes just yet. But thank you so much to everyone who contributed. Maybe just one last round of just where people can get in touch with you if you're open to connecting with anyone, and maybe just last and final. I like ending with a bit of a motivation for the farmers in the space and researchers and everyone within the sector. I'm going to start from the top. Tudukunda, maybe with you, Diana, and then Dr. Bello, and then I'll end up with two more. Thank you so much.
While we're waiting on Rido to speak, I saw there were quite a lot of questions on where to get adaptable seeds for your environment. Summing up, I'll just like to say, remember, the seed companies that produce the seeds are trying to sell the seeds to you. So they'll try to advertise them as much as they can. So if you know the company, like the doctor said, if your seeds are being produced by ARC, they have information, email them. ARC also has information on other cultivars. But if you know, let's say, Pana is producing the seed you're interested in, there is a helpline. Call them, ask. They want you to know the information. They are selling it to you. It's a product. So they would advertise it in a way and give you enough information on that specific seed. And thank you, Dawn, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Diana, to you and for always being willing to contribute and for sharing your knowledge and skills and research with us. Thank you so much. Dr. Bello, just your final comments. Thanks.
Just like the last speaker said, I think if you look at ARC website, there are lots of information you can get from there. Even mention the app. We even have a app that you can download on your phone that has to do with the maize production. That is even, then there's other apps that can even advise in terms of the other production. There is a particular app that the small scale farmer that does not even have Android phone can use. I think it's called the Rain. It's called the Rain Cloud, or so. And lot of production guides. So if you have something that you is not clear in terms of the where to get the seed, type of the seed, the advice. Even there, I've seen people working into ARC with kind of insect and the crop that's actually diseased. They come to say, we don't know what is wrong in our field. Can you please identify for us? Those things we can also try to help with. We also think about how to help in terms of the climate change adaptation and mitigation. In thinking of those, we also think in the climate smart way. Because once we are able to take care of those two components in our field, we are being climate smart.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bello. Tumo, just your last comment?
My comment is going to touch on what Diana said. I think, as scientists and seed companies and plant breeders, every single thing we do is for the farmers. We don't do any research that is for our interest, but always have the farmer, not just commercial farmers, but also small farmers in mind. So if you need any information, don't be afraid to reach out to the commercial farm, to the commercial seed companies, the research institute, such as SASRI, which we have so many programs that we are focused in attracting and also sustaining these small-scale farmers to show that they have a place within the agricultural industry where they can contribute as much as these large and private farmers are contributing. So if any information is needed by the farmer, they can easily contact any association or entity that deals with the crop of interest, and they will receive more information than they thought they would. Some of these companies actually going out of their way to developing apps, as Dr. Bella said, for people who don't have access to smartphones. I've seen guides at South Street being made for people who are speaking different languages. So one guide was made in all of South Africa's official languages. So farmers should not be afraid to reach out to these institutions to require help, and they will receive it free of charge. No need to pay for consultations or anything. Just reach out and help will be given.
Thank you so much, Tumo. And I'm not sure, I think maybe Rukunda's network is not working so well. But I do appreciate her comments as well and for her being part of the conversation tonight. Have a lovely rest of the evening and everything of the best with your farming journeys, with your research, with whatever you're doing to advance not only agriculture in South Africa, but Africa and all over the world. So thank you so much. Have a lovely evening. Bye for now.